Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll just get settled. So we're so glad you could all be here tonight. I'm curious, just a show of hands, how many of you have been here to GMRI before? Okay, good. Welcome back. And to those of you that haven't been to this space before, welcome. We're so glad you could be here. So the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, just to give you a little background, we develop and deliver collaborative solutions to global ocean challenges, and none more pressing than climate change. And so typically speaking, this room would be filled with about 100 students twice a day, or 100 students,
50 students twice a day.
Yeah, 50 students twice a day. So about 100 students that use these tables, as I mentioned, that are like giant iPads, to address the same questions that our researchers are working on in the lab to develop the climate literate next generation. So today we're going to dive into sea level rise, and we've got Maine Monitor, Maine Monitor sponsored by the Pulitzer Center, who are co-sponsoring the event along with Buck Lab at Colby. So we're so excited to be partnering with you guys. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to our moderator, Gail. Sorry, wait. No, I'm not that. Gail, we're so glad to have Gail here with us. Gail is the director of the Buck Lab at Colby College. She's a faculty member in the Environmental Studies Department, where she also directs the Buck Lab for Climate and Environment. She teaches courses on environmental public health, justice, and activism, and recently wrote a textbook entitled Human Health and the Climate Crisis. Her research focuses on PFAS solutions in the local environment, as well as local food access challenges. So please welcome Gail as our moderator for this evening.
Thank you so much, Brenda. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great. Well, it's really great to be here. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you to everyone who's joining us online as well. I'm delighted to be moderating tonight's panel discussion on the critical issue of sea level rise and its impacts on Maine's coastal communities. Along Maine's coastline, vulnerable communities are wrestling every day with the consequences of climate change-driven sea level rise. Communities are being forced to make costly decisions about vulnerable infrastructure and in some cases rethink patterns of life that they have known for generations. The Maine Monitor explored these issues in its feature piece, The Unstoppable Ocean, 10 Stories from the Edge of Maine, which is, and there are copies on the tables in front of you. This was supported as part of the Pulitzer Center's nationwide Connected Coastlines reporting initiative. And from 1,500 buildings in Wells to oil storage tanks in South Portland to a valuable dike in Machias that's protecting landowners from the waters of the Atlantic, these stories highlight how coastal towns in Maine are at risk, and now and in the near future, from sea level rise, and in the face of a great deal of uncertainty, how towns are starting to take action, measuring ocean heights, studying the threat of saltwater intrusion into groundwater, raising a road that goes to a local hospital, planning for moving a historic cemetery that's at the ocean's edge. On behalf of Colby's Buck Lab for Climate and Environment, I'm so pleased to be partnering with the Maine Monitor and the Gulf of Maine Research Institute to bring this expert panel discussion to you all, so that together we can explore the problem of sea level rise and its impacts in Maine, how we should understand it now and in the future, and what solutions should be implemented or considered now and in the future. So we will first hear from our panelists, and then we look forward to questions and comments from the audience here and also on Zoom. And we'll have a microphone for audience members when it comes to the Q&A time. So let me get right to our panel. All the panelists were involved with the Unstoppable Ocean piece and have amazing perspectives on sea level rise. So I'll start with the person nearest to me. Dr. Hannah Baranes is a scientist at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute in their Climate Center, and she's researching sea level rise and coastal flooding. And her goal is to develop localized flood projections that can be used for community resilience planning along Maine's open coast and estuaries. And next to her is Kate Kopp, who is the reporter for the Maine Monitor, she wrote this special piece, The Unstoppable Ocean. She covers energy and environment. And previously, she was a reporter and a digital media strategist for the Ellsworth American and Mount Desert Islander. Kate received a degree from the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. Next to her is Alison McKellar, who is a watershed health advocate who lives in Camden and is vice chair of the Camden Select Board. And over the past 5 years, Alison has made it both a habit and a hobby to document the impacts of high tides and extreme rainfall events in Camden. And she also writes a weekly column for the local newspaper that often deals with climate-related topics. Next to her is Peter Slovinsky, who is a marine geologist with the Maine Geological Survey in the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry. And he's been in that position since 2001. His current work focuses on sea level rise, coastal hazards, beach and shoreline erosion mapping, as well as supporting communities in understanding and developing adaptation strategies and advising on municipal, regional, and state level decision-making. And last but certainly not least, we have Alex MacLean, who is a pilot and aerial photographer whose amazing photographs illustrate the piece. Alex has flown his plane over much of the United States, documenting the landscape in powerful and descriptive images that provide clues to understanding the relationship between the natural and constructed environments. So thank you so much to all of you for being part of this panel discussion. And I think we'll just jump right in. The first question is for Peter. You look at the issue of sea level rise across the entire Maine coast. How do you look at this challenge and where do you see the greatest risks?
Share microphone, so I apologize. It's a really good question. I mean, the challenges that are numerous. I mean, even just communicating about sea level rise is sometimes a challenge because most folks think it's something that is this very, very slow, drawn out process that's not going to be influencing them during their lifetimes. You know, all of the data that we're looking at is showing us that sea level is rising, and about 50% of the rise that's occurred over the last 100 years has occurred since 1990. So that rate of sea level rise is getting much higher. But folks still sometimes think it's something that's not just something to worry about until way, way out there. You know, I think another challenge is the fact that in the past we never really had a unified state approach dealing with sea level rise. It was pretty much home rule Maine. Each community kind of doing their own thing. Some folks working in the field, going out to communities and trying to support them, but it really resulted in what we call a kind of a patchwork or a quilt of resiliency. We've got community A caring about it and doing something, community B not doing something. Another challenge has been lack of capacity at the local level, the regional level, and the state level. We're started kind of getting at that now with the current administration and the Maine Won't Wait process and all scientific data that's been fed through that whole process, funding that's now in place to help support a lot of things. We now provide a lot of technical assistance to other partners, not just at the state level. A lot of non-governmental organizations are participating in being partners in getting scientific data out there, working on the ground with communities. I think another challenge is instituting equitable adaptation responses through our 142 coastal communities. Again, each of them have different capacity levels. Many communities don't even have a planner, so we've got a lot of things to build. But I think the final challenge, and then I'll move on to risks, right? The final challenge is really responding. How do we respond to sea level rise? And I want to plant this in your mind for the rest of the conversation we're having. There's really only 5 ways to respond. First is avoid. Okay, don't build in hazardous areas. You just if it's open land, and it's going to flood, let's not build there. The second is do nothing. If you know you have coastal property and you have space and there's some erosion occurring, but your property's fine, you don't do it. The next is accommodate and adapt. Okay, so that's, for instance, if you live along the coast and you get some flooding, you raise your house up on posts. You institute a living shoreline, things like that. Another one is protect. In some areas, we are going to protect. It's very, very unlikely that the entire city of Portland is going to pick up and move in response to sea level rise. So there are going to be areas that it makes economic sense to protect. And then finally, and it's the word that is probably the toughest to discuss, is retreat. We in Maine are going to have to respond in some areas by retreat. Things are going to flood too many times, and probably economics is going to drive it. But retreat is something that has to be considered in responding. Risks. You know, I think of risk associated with sea level rise. It kind of ties to that long-term, very slow thing that you don't really expect happening. But just to give you an example, nuisance flooding is a risk of sea level rise. You know, Portland, downtown Portland, the low-lying areas historically flooded around 4 times a year. Over the last decade, that's anywhere between 10 and 12 times a year. Okay, so that risk just shows itself. And as you add sea levels rise, that risk increases 8 to 10-fold, and then potentially even 25 to 40-fold when we start looking at sea level rise scenarios that the state of Maine has adopted out to 2050. I also think of critical infrastructure. Okay, the pieces of infrastructure that are the lifelines for communities: roads, evacuation routes, wastewater treatment plants, and working waterfronts. How are they going to be responding to sea level rise? I think that's a huge risk right there. Another risk is our natural environment. It has responded for a long period of time to slow changes in sea level rise, and faster changes in sea level rise, actually. But it never had to do so with humans. With humans in the picture, we've established boundaries, we've established property lines, we've established walls. So the resources, think of marshes, beaches, dunes, those things. Historically, their response was to migrate inland in response to sea level rise. So what you had at time A, simply at time B, when sea level was higher, is still there. But when you institute hard boundaries, there are certain things, certain natural features that are going to struggle to keep up with the rate of sea level rise. And I think the other risk that I wanted to touch on is realizing that this issue is already here today. And it's just going to continue to get worse with time as we move into the future. So the time to act and start to respond is now, and not say, let's not worry about it until 10, 20, 30%.
Thank you so much. So the next question is for Hannah. A major obstacle to planning for sea level rise is the uncertainty in projections beyond, say, the next few decades. Where does the uncertainty come from, and can we expect projections to become less uncertain?
Thanks. I feel like I have the easy job of just stating what the problem is. So it really, the uncertainty in sea level projections, particularly as you look out towards the end of the century, really comes from what are humans going to do in terms of the amount we emit, and how are ice sheets going to respond to future potential increases in temperature. And when I say ice sheets, I mean Greenland in the northern hemisphere and the west and east Antarctic ice sheet in the southern hemisphere. So to dig into that a little more, all the 3 ice sheets combined so far have contributed about 2 inches to global sea level rise. If you were to melt the entire things, you'd get over 200 feet of sea level rise. So there's a lot of water locked up in those ice sheets, and what they do is really the big driver of what's going to happen. So when we look back to back in geologic time, there are time periods when carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere were similar to what they are today, but sea level was tens of feet higher. And we know that from geologists going out and mapping things like coral reefs that are sitting like way up high above present day sea level. And so what we understand now is that there are these physical mechanisms of instability in ice sheets. You can think of it as essentially as at some point you cross some temperature increase threshold where you open a gate and you get rapid ice melt that's not reversible on human timescales. And so what we're really still trying to work out is when do we reach those thresholds? And we think it could be as soon as about a degree and a half warming Celsius relative to pre-industrial times, which is maybe a number that's familiar from the Paris Agreement. And then second question is, once you start to reach those thresholds, how fast does melting happen? And I think that was it. I might have had one more thing, but I can come back to it if it comes to me.
Great, thank you. So now we're gonna shift. Oh,
I got it.
yeah.
I just didn't even answer the second part of the question, which was, when might we expect uncertainty to be reduced?
Yeah.
So, there have been huge increases in monitoring of ice sheets. So actually taking measurements in Greenland and Antarctica to figure out how it's responding to warming now. And that drastically improves model performance. So like computer models we use to try to predict what's going to happen in the future. And then also we're getting sort of a better vision of how much warming is actually happening as we progress through time. So I'd say like mid-century, we'll have quite a bit better of an idea of the future we're looking at.
I'm a journalist, so I'm much more comfortable asking questions than I am anything else. Can you talk a little bit about monitoring? I know when you and I spoke, we talked about tide gauges and sort of the lack of tidal gauges up and down the coast of Maine and how that complicates the work that you are trying to do. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. The Maine project in particular, or modeling of ice sheets.
The Maine project.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I was just chatting with Katie before this about a project we're doing to install new low-cost water level monitors along the coast of Maine. We have models that both forecast water levels over a few days, for example, if a storm is coming, and models that are going to be trying to predict future flood hazard in Maine. But it's really hard to develop models when you don't have measurements. We call that validating a model. So basically measurements that tell you whether or not your model is right. So the same way that scientists who study polar regions are working to get more measurements in Greenland and Antarctica to improve their global sea level rise models, we're also working locally in Maine to take some of those local measurements to improve flood hazard projections at a really kind of community scale.
Yeah.
Are there, and just as a quick follow-up, I'm just thinking, are there bodies of water where it's actually more or less certain in terms of modeling? Like, is there anything special about the Gulf of Maine, that allows you to characterize sea level rise there compared to other bodies of water, or is it kind of more of a problem everywhere or a similar problem everywhere?
I think you could broadly characterize it as a similar problem everywhere, but in different places, there are different local factors that have different impacts on sea level rise. So for example, along the Gulf of Mexico coastline, pumping of oil and groundwater is causing land to sink really fast, which makes you experience relatively more sea level rise. In the Gulf of Maine, we have the Gulf Stream current changing. So like right now, you can think of the Gulf Stream as a hose that's like a jet of water that's pulling water away from the coastline. As it slows down, we get some water kind of sloshing back up against the coast. So if you break it down kind of physical driver by physical driver of sea level rise, you have different sources and amounts of uncertainty.
Great, thank you. So we're gonna shift and talk about a specific place that is experiencing the effects of sea level rise, and we'll pose a question to Alison. In Camden, where you live, you're trying to make decisions now that will safeguard the town's waterfront for the long term, and you're the vice chair of the select board. What is the role of the select board? How does the select board do that? And also, what factors are you considering?
Yeah, what is the role of the select board? Is anybody here involved in local town government anywhere? Good. So the role of the select board is kind of a subjective thing. The model that we have for town government is very decentralized. So the power, select board has very little power. We have the power basically to put questions out to voters for approval. And so every time we think there needs to be a change, we are constantly thinking, okay, is this going to be something we're going to be able to explain to voters? How difficult is that going to be? How controversial is it going to be? It's very, very arduous. And so there's definitely a tendency to avoid planning and change for really as long as possible, because when you're telling people that they need to make a change, it's really much easier to point to a bridge that has fallen down. Well, we have no other choice but to, you know, repair the bridge, and here's what we can do. People understand that a lot more easily than this idea of, well, science says that in 20 years we might need to do this or that. So what I found is that even though, you know, I lived in Camden, I grew up in Camden, there was a lot that I just didn't know. And a lot of the time when we're sitting in select board meetings, we don't really know what we're talking about. People would come and students would come and say, you guys should do something about climate change. And, you know, we would say that's such a distant problem in our minds compared to, you know, the immediate controversy of the fact that, you know, somebody wants to build something or, you know, we need to get X, Y, or Z done. And it was really having kids that brought me down to the harbor in a way that I hadn't spent like hours and hours and hours and hours continuously at the harbor before. My kids love to fish. And I started noticing that the seawall in the harbor park was overtopping like way more frequently than I was aware. And it was oftentimes when it wasn't like predictable. It would, you know, I would say we're going to have an 11.5 foot high tide, but which wasn't by any means the highest tide of the year, but there's water coming over the seawall. And so I kind of became obsessed with documenting all of these events because people so often would think, oh, well, this is, you know, something that happens once in a blue moon. I don't know, is there time? Are we going to show the video? So I think one of the biggest things has been like, you know, how do we protect the waterfront? Well, to a lot of people, protecting the waterfront means different things. For some people, it's that intertidal zone where you can explore and look under seaweed and find crabs and see this sort of magical up and down of the tide and the beach being exposed and then it being really high. You know, to other people, it's being able to sit in the grassy area on a bench and, you know, look over the wall. And so just getting to the point where we can agree on, you know, what we're trying to protect is hard, especially when we're not always down there. So this is just a couple minutes of footage that I've taken over the past. Yeah, so basically it's been sort of this shift in the conversation from something that's, you know, going to happen in 20 or 50 years to realizing like, wow, this is already happening a whole lot. And so before we rebuild, the seawall's falling down a little bit. It's, before we go and rebuild it and repair it the way it is, it doesn't make a lot of sense to rebuild exactly the way things are right now. It's already overtopping, so.
I had an observation real quick. Do you mind going to slide 6 real quick? Yeah. So I think what Alison said is really, really powerful. First of all, number one, at the local level, local governance level, every two years, right? You're serving on the select board. Right, okay, it varies, but there's this institutional knowledge. There's this institutional knowledge that doesn't necessarily get passed from select board to select board, yet the issue of sea level rise and coastal flooding continues. So one of the key things is we need to maintain this institutional knowledge. And the other thing is, so I can go and show you graphs of sea level rise, and as a scientist, Hannah and I can explain why this is happening, what the trend is and all that. But anecdotal evidence from inside the community, like what Alison just shared, is typically what resonates with people more than a graph being shown up on the screen. So there were just two observations that I thought were really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, just real quick, one of the things I noticed is that you can look at the tide charts, and the lack of gauges in different communities is definitely an issue. Camden is just the tide charts are just a prediction based on other gauges in different places. And it gives you a rough idea, but a lot of the time, it turns out to be different than what's on there based on how a lot of it's how the wind is blowing. And so we've learned that, okay, if the wind is blowing from the east, it's like just really drastically changes the way everything behaves. And so even like if climate change were to cause us to start having more storms where the wind was blowing from the east, that would, really kind of devastate us. It doesn't do all that much damage when it just gently overtops the seawall, but you get some wind and it just causes so much damage, pulling everything out from behind those structures.
I would say that one of the challenges to reporting on this is that not every town has an Alison. So, I think it's really difficult for people to visualize this. That I had not seen all that footage put together. It was powerful even for me to look at it all kind of in aggregate like that, because, you live in a place and maybe the tide is high and it's high at midnight, and you're not wandering down to the harbor at midnight to look at the high tide overtopping the seawall or down, by the waterfront. And when you don't see it all kind of together like that, it can be easy to say, we're all living our lives. There's a lot of things going on. We're not, it can be easy to just say, well, I think that happened last year, but it hasn't been, it's been a while, and it was really windy that day. And, so it can be easy to kind of dismiss it. And it was challenging in that sense to report on this because, Alison had so much footage to show me. She said, oh, I'm down there all the time. She goes down at midnight or, whenever it is. And she sent me just like reams of photos. And in most other cases, people would say, yeah, I kind of remember that, 20 years ago when I was a kid, it feels very different now, but I'm not really sure. And so I think it's very powerful. If any of you want to go out and document this, I will take it from you, because it makes my job way easier.
On that note, actually, I'm going to put in a little plug for my amazing colleague back there, Gail Bodis. She runs a community science, sort of flood observation program. So GMRI has something called the Ecosystem Investigation Network, where you can go and upload these photos to a database. And as a part of this tide gauge project I mentioned, we're pairing each gauge with a community science program where we're going to have volunteers go out and document flood impacts during predicted tides. So if any of you live in Portland or St. George or Booth Bay, come talk to us and if you'd like to get involved.
Actually, if I could, there's a good, can you guys hear me? There is a good question follow on from this discussion from our Zoom audience. So Tracy asked, one of the issues is that our current sea level rise is from our climate inaction from 30 years ago. How can we educate our community who already feels that this is an issue, that this issue is a future problem? So Alison, I don't know if you want to talk about sort of what are you doing with your videos, your pictures, or what is the select board doing to try and educate? Or maybe Hannah, you can talk a little bit more about what GMRI is doing.
Yeah, I mean, I have seen the conversation in Camden shift quite a bit from when I started. I remember the student from the watershed school came in and they showed us one photo of those benches underwater. And we were all like, oh, wow, it's already starting in Camden. You know, we didn't realize this, that, you know, it's like, really, it's going to happen. This is going to happen to Camden too. Camden's not going to be immune from this. but it was still like, I would hear all the time from people, well, this has been happening forever. This isn't, people want to put this into like a political spectrum of, okay, she's talking about sea level rise. So she's a liberal Democrat and she voted for so-and-so, and this all falls into this narrative. And I tried to stop talking about like climate change or global warming or what was causing it, or in Camden, we just needed to like agree, like, okay, if you're saying this has been happening and okay, the ocean's been changing for thousands of years, sure, yeah, okay. Clearly, this is, I don't think the Olmsted brothers designed Harbor Park to overtop like this. So just, taking that part out of the equation, like, definitely there's a need to talk about the causes of all of this and what it's, whether things are accelerating because of human activity or not. But even if you just leave that part out a little bit and agree that, yes, there's sea level rise is happening, and then showing all the pictures a lot did kind of take away. I haven't been hearing recently like, oh, this never happens in Camden, the seawall doesn't overtop. What we're arguing about now is more how should we adapt to it? We have a camp of people that think, well, it's very simple. We just need to raise the seawall. We just need to build it higher. And that, that was kind of like a victory in a lot of ways. Like, okay, we're having a different conversation now. Now we can talk about what would happen if you do that. A lot of people we haven't mostly gotten around to thinking about what is this going to do to the low tide area? Is this an area that do we care about having a beach in the future? Because if we do, and we don't want it to be just, a wall with, ocean that rises and falls, if you want to have that rocky exposed area, then retreat is, our only option if we want to preserve that. So I have seen the conversation shift a lot by just looking at pictures as much as possible and trying to really like depoliticize it as much as possible.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And I'll talk about Gail's work again. Gail goes into communities and does sea level rise planning scenario work. And she starts all of her workshops by, like, rather than showing a chart like this or talking about what's going to happen, she starts from a place by kind of a collective discussion or visioning of like, well, what do we value about our community now and what do we want to preserve in the future? And starts the conversation from that common ground.
I think when I was doing the reporting on this, I asked everybody I interviewed, I asked, where is a place that you love that's been affected by sea level rise? And if you ask people questions like that, they always have an answer. There's a beach. I mean, I think you told me, you'd love to go to Higgins Beach, right? You're a surfer and you like to go to Higgins Beach. And so we all have answers to that question. And so I think if you can reframe it in those terms, it's just much more effective. But my job is way easier than I want to do. So.
Yeah, and the video again is just so powerful to see. And as someone who lives inland, I live in Waterville, we also, people who live inland, we aren't observing it day to day. So it's so important to have this record because we also, have special places on the coast, but also thinking about Maine's climate plan, it's really a statewide thing. And so to build, support and buy-in from a lot of people, really, means that we can have sort of statewide conversations, including talking about sea level rise with people who don't live on the coast. So yeah, really, really powerful video. Kate, as the reporter on this piece, can you talk just a little bit about kind of what stuck with you as you were researching and reporting on this? What were some of the most significant impacts of sea level rise or community impacts that you observed?
I think the thing that stuck with me most was that we don't have a centralized office to deal with this. Like there was nobody. I mean, oftentimes when I'm doing this kind of work, I can call somebody at the DEP and there's like an office of such and such, and I call them up and I say, hey, you are the experts. Tell me all about this. Thankfully, I found Peter, who is the state expert on this. But in many states, there is kind of a centralized place where you can go to get information, and communities can have kind of a touch point for their work on this. So that was it was frankly very surprising to me because we are a state with 5,000 miles of coastline, whatever the gauge is at this point. So that was surprising. And I was also really struck by just the different approaches that communities have to take to deal with this issue. I mean, it is so individualized, and that's for a variety of reasons. I mean, as Hannah said, that they just geographically, it's very different. Geologically, it's different. And so the sea reacts differently in different places. Places have different resources. So I think just the sort of disparity between all of those things was really surprising. And I, in terms of the actual, like the visual impacts of sea level rise, I was 30 weeks pregnant while I was reporting this story. So I did not do a lot of driving around the state, but I grew up in Maine and I have been to all of these places, at one point in my life. So I was kind of able to visualize them. But I talked to a lot of people in these communities, obviously, and I asked them about the changes that they had seen, and I could kind of visualize, I mean, I've driven over that causeway in Stonington 1,000 times, and I have personally never driven over it when it's underwater. But I talked to Kathleen Billings, and she said, "Oh no, it's it's underwater this many times a year," and I could see that, and I can see it in my own community. I live in Bar Harbor, and so that's the causeway that I love. We should hear from Alex at some point because his photos, I think, are just so spectacular, and this is one of my favorites. But I live in Bar Harbor. I used to live in Southwest Harbor, and we would periodically go down to the seawall in Southwest Harbor, and during storms, and we have this huge long beach with these beautiful rocks, and they were just washed up over the road. And over the course of the 5 or 6 years that I've lived there, it's happened more and more frequently, and I didn't have the foresight to take videos, which I now kick myself for. But so I see it in my own life. I see it in the parking lot in downtown Portland. I grew up in Portland. I don't really remember that parking lot flooding when I was a kid, but I've seen it flood as an adult. So yeah, it's all over the place. Yeah.
Yeah, and let's hear from Alex. Maybe we can pose a similar question as you looked at the Maine coast from the air and were taking your photographs. What did you see? What are the things that stick in mind?
Well, you definitely see the vulnerabilities, and it was interesting. Going from Portsmouth up to Portland, the edge is very different when you get north of that, and I was really surprised just how fortified the whole coastline was going up to that point, and the seawalls starting to fall in, and you could just sense that this is going to be a constant struggle and a lot of money. And then you see areas such as in Wells, barrier beach there, built up with housing. And, you know, it's just, right here. You just look at that, just how fragile that is against, an ocean that's rising. And so it's, it just, you know, it looks just like a matter of time, really. And so, but at the same time, it's a huge resource, and it's, you know, such a great place to be, as you see beachgoers right here. But it's fragile, and you can't help but sense this in so many different ways. You go inland, you see the wetlands there, and realize it's going to be rising water, and infrastructure, the rail lines you see going through wetlands, all that is so threatened. And you know, the extent and the cost of trying to keep up with this, it's kind of staggering. When you look at it in the time frame of, you know, 10, 15 years, 20 years, and what the projections are, you know, going up to 2050, which is not that far off, you're talking, you know, 1.5 feet or more of sea level rise. It's just going to be huge.
Right, yeah, with the cost, it's like, when you look at any one place in Camden, for instance, that's having issues, it's easy to say, oh, well, it's very simple. We'll just raise this up and, you know, it'll be the same. But if you apply that same strategy everywhere, you're just looking at massive costs. And it's, you know, the cost of fighting the ocean everywhere is insane. I mean, if you had to look at what the cost was going to be to apply that strategy everywhere, nobody would think that was a good idea. But when you look at each individual place, it's like, no, I want this one to stay the same and this one to stay the same. But, you know, people, private property owners are doing a lot of armoring. And for each one of those properties individually, it makes sense for them. But we haven't really done any kind of education to help people understand that every time you armor a shoreline, it ends up, you know, all of that wave energy tends to get deflected somewhere else. So you may have prevented some erosion on your property, but it's going to go over to your neighbors. And so we really need to plan for that comprehensively and say, okay, there's a real value in having parts of the shoreline be natural and having the, you know, sand and shoals and, you know, that rocky kind of dynamic coastline that really helps to break things up. There's a benefit to all of us, and a real cost if we take our whole shoreline and turn it into concrete. Not to mention, you know, the aesthetic impact of that. I mean, so many people, I think, come to Maine and enjoy that natural, rugged coastline, and so, but it's really hard when you're just looking at what's right in front of you.
Yeah, I'd like to just add, can you go to slide 37? Alex's image is really, really powerful, and kind of gets back to that whole anecdotal information is better than science. I mean, so here we are looking at the beach at Wells, and you mentioned you saw a lot of seawalls in summer, and it's true, about 50% of our beaches in southern Maine have seawalls on them already. So at those locations, by 2050, 40% of the dry beach that exists will probably be gone, because if you look on this image right here, you can see where all the people are. You see a dune right behind there. That beach can move. That beach has room to move in response to sea level rise. You will have a beach there probably in 2050. To the right, there are just walls. And you can already see at high tide, the high tide probably comes closer to the walls. So that area of dry beach is what's at risk. And our studies in the state have shown again that 40% of the dry beach will be lost probably by the year 2050, which is a staggering number when you think about it. But I just, this image really kind of sells it to me.
Have you done any mapping of that? I know in Camden, we focus a lot on flood mapping and looking at, okay, this is me flooded, this is me flooded, this is me flooded. But is there something statewide that would show, okay, this is where the new low tide level would be under these projections?
Yeah, we've done statewide mapping of kind of sea level rise scenarios, but it just shows kind of the upper edge of what would happen. We haven't done the lower edge yet because we actually don't have enough quality data to define the lower edge. That is changing. There's new data that's being collected on the whole coast of Maine, literally right now, that will allow scientists to do analysis like that.
Okay. Let me know when you're finished.
That's great. That's kind of a success story. So segueing into my next question before we take questions from the audience, really quickly, can each of you just talk about what you see as a really important solution, or maybe even a success story where an effective strategy is already being implemented? So, you know, just one thing, where do we go from here? And go ahead. Do you want to start, Alison?
Sure. Can you sense the excitement in my eyes? So, a few years ago, when we started talking about this in Camden, we were looking actually at the dam that's right there in the harbor, and sort of the interconnection between sea level rise and flooding. And a lot of the experts, like from NOAA and different agencies like that, started saying, you should apply for coastal resilience funding, and this really fits into that. And that really caused us to understand how some of the issues with the dam are interconnected with flooding and all of those risks. And there is so much funding available to solve these problems right now. And the great thing is that there's actually like bipartisan support for solutions that emphasize natural solutions. Nature-based solutions is the big thing right now. And so there are billions of dollars available to help communities adapt if we're willing to do it in a way that uses nature and not more rocks and natural type of shorelines, rather than human-made structures that everybody knows are going to fall apart. So what we found also is that a lot of the solutions that are more resilient and cost less for humans are also really big, have really big habitat benefits too. And so there's all this money available if you can adapt something and improve habitat for anything from fish to different types of crabs. And so it's just a really exciting time, actually, to have just a huge amount of money at our disposal to do things in a better way. And it's going to mean change, but a lot of the things in Camden, for instance, that we love so much, they came about because there was some kind of major devastation. Harbor Park, that all happened because a hotel burned down, and Mrs. Bach started to buy up all these properties, and she took buildings down, and she built the library and did Harbor Park. And that was a really radical thing at the time. It was only possible because of like devastation to begin with. And we're kind of facing that same thing now, only it's going to happen slowly. And so if we can kind of have that vision of saying, wow, there's change is inevitable. Change is going to happen whether we plan for it or not. But if we plan for it in a way that benefits biodiversity and habitat and humans, we're going to get a lot of money to do it, and it can be, kind of for the better. If we want to just keep going down the same road and patching things up, taxpayers are going to have to spend, a lot of their money to do it. So it's a pretty exciting time. There's never been so much funding available as there is now.
I want to go to what I think are a couple success stories. If that's all right. Real quick. Let's just slide on the board. Number 18. Sorry, I like this. This is Damariscotta. So this is, I don't know, folks have probably been to Damariscotta before, but their parking lot right there is the hub for not only Damariscotta, but Damariscotta serves as the hub for many communities around it. And this is a very urbanized, historic area. Those houses in there are historical. It's currently in the floodplain. And their response to this goes to that protect adaptation strategy, which I described earlier. What they're doing at this location is that seawall, that riprap seawall that you see there, that's going to be torn apart. That is going to be integrated with nature-based solutions. So there's going to be vegetative plantings, terraced vegetative plantings there. But what they're doing is they're actually going to be elevating that entire parking lot and then building a wall on the inner edge of the parking lot. to protect their parking lot, and it's probably going to be 3 feet high above the 100-year floodplain. So they're currently planning to be able to protect that parking lot and all the infrastructure in there for up to about 3 feet of sea level rise. And they said beyond that, we'll let the next couple generations worry about it. But that's a big step, and it took them over a decade to get there. So there's one example. Another example that I think is really good in Saco is another nature-based solution example is the construction of a dune. So after everybody remember the Patriots Day storm in 2007? Well, massive erosion down in Saco, and I don't know if you have an image of the actual dune here, but anyway, just north of where the seawalls end is a natural dune system, and that dune got hit really hard. And what happened was we worked with the community and the Ferry Beach Park Association down there and developed a new dune for them, but it didn't hold the line, because originally every time a dune gets washed out, people rebuild the dune back where it was, and it gets washed out again. So what we worked with them to do was actually to build a back dune bridge. So instead of trying to build that frontal dune up that gets hit by every storm, where if you built it, probably would get taken out the next winter, we built up the back dune bridge much higher. And then the whole frontal area we just left, and that was sacrificial. And Camp Ellis in Saco has a very bad erosion problem. That dune is still there, and that was built in 2009. So it's an example of mimicking what would be there naturally, just kind of putting it in a slightly different location, and then allowing nature to take its course. And it's been very effective. So I wanted to throw those two case studies out there.
Hello. Oh, there we go. I would say a couple of solutions, or that I think. Well, I'm excited about the fact that DOT is incorporating sea level rise into their planning now. So that's a huge victory. I mean, you, I'm sure, know more about that than I do, but that's a huge victory. It was not always the case. So now they are at least taking into account sea level rise, and when they redo roads and bridges and culverts, they are, building them bigger or taller, or just so they can manage and handle. I'm not sure how far out it is that they're planning for.
Yeah. So DOT has kind of, so the state has adopted what's called the intermediate, slide 7, please, intermediate scenario for sea level rise. So what this is telling us is, this is out to the year 2050, but the intermediate, this is the low, so the historical data is the blue line, the dashed blue line that you see there, the kind of jumping one, that's 1912 to 2022. And then 3 scenarios, low, intermediate, and high. The state has adopted the intermediate scenario to 2050, which is 1.5 feet and 4 feet by the year 2100. DOT, and I'm of course not with DOT, but they have adopted a looking at 2 and 4 feet sea level rise for their infrastructure improvements. So if they can build their bridge, let's use the bridge as an example, to accommodate for 4 feet of sea level rise, and then make sure that all the grades can grade into the neighboring roads, and people's houses aren't going to be below the bridge, no driveway access, et cetera, they will try to build things to 4 feet of sea level rise. If they can't, they'll do the 2. So they've kind of fallen to this de facto let's use the 4 feet by the year 2100. But if we can't physically design for that, we're going to do the 2. So, and that's something that they've informally been doing for a long period of time, but formally have adopted those scenarios into their planning strategies. I think that's a big step.
And I believe FEMA is also updating our flood maps to include sea level rise. No, we're not.
Not yet.
Not yet.
So FEMA flood maps only show what the 1% or 100-year quote unquote storm water level will be, and it gives you information on whether it's a dynamic zone which has waves in it, or a static zone that doesn't have waves. It incorporates what sea level rise has occurred since the last time it's been mapped, but does not incorporate future sea level rise. If you want to do that, you have to develop that data on your own, and then get FEMA to approve it. Yeah. So, but their scientific and technical advisory committee, or STAC, has been having some conversations as to whether or not some kind of sea level rise data should be integrated into flood maps. But currently, they are not.
I have something to write about now.
Maybe I'll just briefly talk about one very different kind of success story. Maine Coast Heritage Trust recently got a bunch of money to purchase and preserve land that's upland of salt marshes. So basically kind of giving a corridor for salt marshes to migrate into. So that's an example of a bit more of a proactive approach.
And I'll add to that. The sea level rise data that we've developed at the Maine Geological Survey, we've put that out there. There are viewers and all kinds of information you can use, but MCHT said, okay, how can we use this data to help inform our land acquisition planning processes? And they developed their own way of taking their properties that they're interested in, our sea level rise data, and then other factors, and putting all that and overlaying it all in like a GIS and looking at all the different layers together and helping use that information to drive their decision making, which I think is a really, really cool thing, because one of the ways to respond to sea level rise is to protect open space. And that's exactly what they're trying to do.
Yeah, Alex, do you want to comment on something that gives you hope?
I have one question, more than anything else, is do you think these projections for sea level rise are actually accurate? Because I've heard that they're going to be a lot higher than what I see here as projections for Maine. Are they just trying to cope with the problem by being very optimistic as opposed to realistic as to what actual sea level rise is?
Sure, yeah. So in 2020, when the Maine Won't Wait report came out, our office, along with some folks at University of Maine, did a pretty good dive into all the research that's occurring in terms of sea level rise, the different scenarios that are out there. And this shows 3 graphs. There are 3 scenarios. There are 6 on this chart. Typically that go out to the year 2100. So, and each one of these scenarios kind of has a different % chance of occurring based on what humans do. The chance of this intermediate scenario occurring, which is that 1.5 feet by the year 2050, under what's called representative concentration pathway 4.5, which says by 2050, we significantly cut, I think it's 2050, right? Yeah, 2050, we significantly cut our emissions. Okay. Yeah. What we have historically is baked into this number, but if we do that, then we're only locked into 1.5 feet for the sea level rise. So we chose the intermediate scenario. It's a little bit more optimistic. So this scenario has about a 17% chance of occurring under.
What's the starting point for 1.5 feet
over the year 2000? Sorry. There is another scenario which says humanity is just going to continue to emit greenhouse gases well into the future and not slow down at all. And that's, I think, called scenario 8.5. Under that scenario, under that scenario, this has a 17% chance of occurring. And under the intermediate scenario, the intermediate level has a 3% chance. So we kind of looked at those statistics and said, well, let's choose something that actually has a chance of occurring. Because once you start getting into the high, intermediate, high, and extreme scenarios that are associated with these curves, the chances of occurring are like 0.01% for some of those. So we wanted to kind of pick something that was realistic, that also tied in with some of the storm surge amounts that we actually see on an annual basis. So that you could marry thinking about sea level rise with storm surges as well. So that's kind of how this intermediate scenario was picked. This is actually old data now. There are new curves that have come out in 2022 from the interagencies to NASA, NOAA, Army Corps of Engineers, and a bunch of other federal agencies. And this intermediate scenario these scenarios have actually grouped much, much closer. So we looked at a curve associated with the newer data. These numbers would all be pretty close out to the year 2050. It would be about 0.8, 1.3, I think, and about 1.5 or 1.7. Okay, so the curves have narrowed because our ability to understand what's happening in Greenland and Antarctica with thermal expansion is getting better. So these numbers actually came down slightly associated with the new data. Where things diverge with all of these curves is as you get out past the year 2050, because it becomes more uncertain as to what's going to happen, because a lot of it has to do what we are going to do as a society in terms of curtailing global emissions. So that's a long-winded answer to your question. But we're pretty comfortable scientifically with the intermediate scenario right now.
Maybe I'll just add one tiny bit of nuance, which is that the intermediate scenario Maine has adopted to reach those values, that value, particularly the 4 feet and 2100, you need to have significant contributions from Greenland and Antarctica. And there's still a world where we don't get there. Like, for example, if all of sort of the
Sorry, no, you're good.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
If all of the targets from countries that are kind of out there, if we meet them, like we might still avoid that. So Maine's targets are relatively conservative in that sense. But if you do enter a world where suddenly Antarctica is melting really rapidly, then seeing high numbers, it's sort of a matter of like when, not if.
And I think that's a very, very key point. The curves that we work with at the state of Maine to create this report and this data went out to the year 2100. The new data that's available now goes out to 2150. And in none of the curves does sea level actually fall. In all of those curves, it continues to rise. So this is something that's baked into what's happening and is going to continue for the foreseeable future. Not it's going to plateau and then suddenly go back down.
Great, thank you so much. We want to make sure we have time to take a few questions. So is there a question from the audience here in person?
So I have two questions, one quick one. But I was just curious if we know the cost of the Damascata project. Just I think it would be helpful to quantify a small project like that, just to think about how these responses are going to cost and sort of extrapolate that out.
Ooh. Hang on. I'm sorry, I don't know that off the top of my head. I'd have to look at it. 4.4. I think that's in there. 4.4. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that number has gone up over time because of the cost of things.
Gotcha. Okay. And then the second one would be so who's not at the table? And I think Kate, you mentioned the lack of a state apparatus, which there's no one really represented here from the state tonight. And then we also, I think also noticed that there's nobody from the fishing industry, and there's nobody, maybe like insurers are missing. So who's not at the table that needs to be? Who's not at the table that needs to be?
That might be a question.
Well, I will point out that there is a Governor's Office for Policy Innovation for the Future, GOPIF is the name. It was formed with the Knowles administration when climate change is a centralized thing, and a very, very important thing for the Knowles administration. And so that office oversees a lot of things and it's a central hub for connecting all of the different agencies that are involved in this kind of work. So yes, Maine doesn't have a centralized climate office per se, but like our office does a lot of the sea level rise work. The University of Maine does a lot of the climate change work. USGS does a lot of hydrogeology work. DEP does the regulatory work, and all of these agencies are kind of centralized hub now to GOPIF. GOPIF is the one that is kind of bringing a lot of this information out, helping write the reports. They're running a lot of grant programs that provide a lot of the funding now. Because before we used to say, here's the problem, but never had any funds to say, here's some funds to go do something now. But there are funds now. What's the other part of your question? Well, I think the insurers one is a big one. That is something that really the whole real estate industry needs to be part of this discussion, because right now, for real estate disclosures, you don't even have to disclose that you're in a flood zone. You don't have to. You don't have to. It's something that really should be there. There should be, you know, working with the real estate industry to get them to integrate some of this information about, you know, is it in a current flood zone? Is it in a sea level rise hazard zone? Is it an erosion hazard area? So a lot of this information does need to get out there. I can't really speak much about the fishing community. I think in terms of the sea level rise relationships with that, you've got working waterfronts, which a lot of communities base their industries on. So that is an extreme what we're trying to discuss how you respond. And then of course, you know, clammers and other people that work mudflats will be changing over time also, or the species is going to shift because of higher water levels. So the mudflat is not exposed at low tide anymore. It's always underwater. There'll still be clams there. There'll probably be a different kind of species. So from that standpoint, from an infrastructure standpoint, I think the fishing community is very, very important to integrate into talking about working waterfronts.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that at the state level, there's a lot going on in terms of expert research and resources that are out there. If you want to sit in a webinar and listen to somebody like Pete talk about the types of things we should be planning for. But in practice, where the rubber meets the road, it's all the local level. We take, great pride in Maine in this home rule authority situation where all local governments, local communities can make all their own rules, as long as, you have the state minimums for shoreline zoning and all that stuff. But anything that's happening right now is because some community decides to have more stringent rules or to go above and beyond. We haven't, and it's a lot of just really small towns with not very many resources. Even Camden that has resources, we are inundated by people, not all of them just moving here. Some of them are people that have been here for a long time, but they inundate our planning and codes office with building requests. They're renovating and building things and near the shore. That ends up taking all of the planning officer, the code enforcement office, all of that, the planning board, they're just, reviewing site plans for these big, like piers going in and things like that. And so all of those resources end up going toward, that kind of thing. And then, everybody's tired by the time it comes around to like, oh, this long-term planning, because we're so busy all the time reacting to the building requests that we're getting. So, it's really key to get super involved at the local level. People joining planning boards. I mean, that's where a lot of the ordinance changes. This all comes down to doing better, comes down to ordinance changes in large part, and it's really boring stuff. But being willing to sit there in those planning board meetings and go through the zoning ordinance and all of that and say, hey, I found this other ordinance in Massachusetts that seems to do better. Let's try to get that passed in our town. But a lot of the time people don't have the patience for that.
Yeah, capacity and bandwidth are two big things. It's like one town that the CEO and code enforcement officer is also the animal catcher, and then also has to do something else. And then they have to worry about trying to get a grant from the state and administer it to do something else. So it really, a lot of it gets back down to that issue. And I had something else to add, but I forgot what it was.
Do we want to take one question? Oh, okay, sorry. Oh, no,
I was just going to say that was something I heard consistently in my reporting, was that the lack of planning capacity is really crippling for towns and for regional planning offices. I mean, I remember I went to call the planning office for Washington County, and they had disbanded. So, there was nobody to call. And I mean, I live in Hancock County. I think we had a regional planner at one point, but now it's just kind of like a house. And I never see anybody over there, so I am not sure what's going on. And people are tired at the end of the day. They have a lot going on, and they don't have the bandwidth to figure this out. But I will say that there is an exciting project in your area. Portland and South Portland, I believe, have developed a model ordinance to deal with some of this that I don't know if anybody knows much about that. I don't know a whole lot about it, but this model ordinances that towns can take and look at and sort of adapt to what they have, you know, in their own community and work off of that, because ordinance language is incredibly complicated for anybody who's ever tried to write it, and it will get challenged by attorney, as Alison knows. So
yeah, I want to add to that real quick. The Southern Maine Planning and Development Commission, who is a commission down that covers York County, basically. They developed a transferable ordinance language document that visits a lot of these things, floodplain management ordinances, shoreline zoning ordinances, and how they can be structured for each community so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel when you're starting to tackle these issues. And it's a transferable document that communities could use. So I don't know if that was what you were referring to.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, okay.
Which is tough, because we all have our existing ordinances, so sometimes it comes down to, well, in order to do that, you'd have to repeal and replace. So it's not always, you know, it sounds simple, like, oh, great, we'll just adopt the model ordinance. But then you've got all this quirky stuff that figuring out how to integrate all that is challenging.
Great, I'm mindful of the time. Do we want to take one more question from the audience? Okay, a couple more questions from the audience here.
Who has a question?
Thanks. Great discussion. Thank you so much. I'm interested in two things. One is, to what extent are there lessons learned from other countries or other states that you're finding valuable, and or are you sharing with other countries, states, the experience from here in Maine, number one? And then number two, we're having this discussion while the COP conference is going on in Egypt, and there's already talk of abandoning or not being able to meet the 1.5 degree change. And I just wonder what the implications of that might be.
John, that's down.
Can you repeat the
I
first part of the
can
question?
start.
Sorry. Yeah. Can you repeat the first one?
About lessons learned from other countries, other states,
Yeah.
either that you've incorporated or that you're sharing.
Yeah, that's a really good question.
We also have the director of our climate center here who might have some insight on that.
Pass that on to David. Yeah, I could mention something, and then David, you can please jump in. But so there is an organization called the Coastal States Organization. And that is an organization of all the states in the U.S. and outlying territories and all that have coastal programs. And these organizations get together every more than every year and discuss a lot of things. So there's a lot of information sharing that occurs there in terms of how is New Jersey tackling the issue of sea level rise, what's Connecticut doing, and we end up talking with all the states and then break up into different regions. There are also other working groups on the national level and international level. For one great one is the Northeast Regional Ocean Council. It's a great hub for the Northeast states, and some of the provinces actually get together and talk about these issues and how things are being tackled and who's doing what. We also work on nature-based solutions projects, marsh migration projects, things like that. And I think I have a link up there for NROC somewhere. Maybe I don't. That was a different presentation. Sorry. And there are also some working groups that incorporate the Canadian provinces, things like that. I think some of the lessons learned that are really important, and then David, that we've kind of tried to integrate into some of our work and thinking is, number one, some of the examples from over in Europe in terms of ways to live with water as opposed to fight water. I think that's really important. And, you know, an example of Holland is a good example of that. And then the way, and this was mentioned several times, the way you can integrate nature-based solutions to dealing with these issues. We're not going to be able to solve all of the issues by protecting everything. We're not going to be able to solve all the issues by accommodating or retreating. It's going to be a combination of all those things. So the more information sharing that occurs between the states and also between, you know, the international international countries is key to, so we don't actually have to reinvent the wheel also.
Yeah, and I guess two things I would say. One is, in the last administration at the federal level, obviously climate change was not the priority it is now. And as a result, you saw it basically served as the catalyst for subnational action. And so there was an entity called the U.S. Climate Alliance that was formed that really brought together a lot of proactive governors in particular that really wanted to tackle climate change in a much more cohesive manner. Maine obviously was an instrumental partner in that. State of Washington, state of California, kind of the typical players that you might expect. But that alliance is now upwards of probably half the states in the country almost, including DC. And it does serve as a forum like the other ones that Pete was mentioning. The other thing I want to highlight is the question on kind of 1.5 degrees and the consequences of this COP, the Conference of the Parties that's going on now. You know, the 1.5 degree target was enshrined into the Paris Agreement as an ambition, not, you know, the Paris Agreement is not any sort of legally binding document, right? In the sense that there's no real teeth to it, other than countries. The only requirement was that countries would put forward a target that they would aspire to in 5 years and then report it, right? But in order to get the small island developing states on board, they needed 1.5 degrees to be explicitly in the Paris Agreement. You can imagine the flip side of that, which was very real, was that the OPEC countries basically said, we cannot have 1.5 degrees because, frankly, that represents a totally different type of existential threat to our country, right? And trying to bridge that nexus between those deeply disparate but entirely valid, you know, issues that folks need to deal with in their domestic political circumstances, bring us to where we are now, right? We see extraordinary volatility in the domestic political scene, and that's manifesting in other places around the world as well. And right now, we're seeing, you know, us trying to recapture that leadership role, right? Biden was just there earlier this week, trying to highlight what the IRA is going to do, right? But I think if you talk to most scientists, and you saw this on a lot of the sidelines in the top, basically saying, look, 1.5 degrees is a great goal to have, but we're going to go past it. And you will not hear a politician say that, right? Especially ones that care about this for very obvious reasons. But from a scientific perspective, you just look at the data. We're going to go past it. 2 degrees is still within reach, but 2 degrees is also, you know, a very ambitious target for us to reach as a goal, right? And so you're seeing, you know, thinking about kind of lessons from abroad. I think most often we tend to look at the Netherlands and Italy and some of these other places that live with water. But we also really have an opportunity to look at the Bangladeshis, the Indonesias of the world, these major, you know, developing countries that have lived with water for generations, for centuries, without a lot of resources to have these sort of built environment solutions, right? You know, Jakarta is literally moving their capital, right? I mean, it's a phenomenal thing that's happening around the world that we need to really kind of think about. And you know, the context of the framework convention of climate change when these COPs happen is a great opportunity. You know, there's all the politics around it, but at the working level, we really do have a good, healthy exchange of ideas, despite the really very real and in many cases very emotional kind of differences in values.
That's a great perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. And if it's something you're interested in, I just want to highlight a resource called the Climate Action Tracker. They put out something called the CAT Climate Action Tracker thermometer that they'll be updating throughout the COP, where they look at how much have we warmed already. And then if you take sort of the most optimistic and least optimistic scenarios in terms of the targets nations are setting, this is how much warming we'll see. So they'll be up there at the COP and they'll be updating it.
Any other questions from the audience? There's a question over here and
Some of our most important coastal ecosystems are our salt marshes. And I'm wondering what your, you know, what insight you have or alarms you have or anything different about the salt marshes.
Yeah,
As it relates to climate change, obviously.
yeah, Pete and I both love to talk about salt marshes, so, okay, I can start. So salt marshes have kind of inherent resilience built into them because like they're constantly losing elevation as they compact under their own weight and get eroded from the edges. And so they do that both by like kind of adding biomass, so that adding organic material as plants decompose and from the root matter of plants, and by importing sediment from other places. And so the question there is really, well, like at what point can marshes not sort of self-regulate and crank up the rate that they're gaining elevation as sea level rises? And that's kind of an answer we don't have yet. In Maine, our marshes are a bit more resilient because of our big tide range. I think kind of a really interesting part of that is, like I mentioned, one of the ingredients for marshes building elevation is having an external source of sediment. So, and often, like if you look at some of those images as we're armoring our coast, you might be choking off a sediment source for some salt marshes. So yeah, maybe you want to fortify a bluff, but then what about the neighboring salt marsh? And those are kind of questions that are, Pete might have some more practical information to add there, but a lot of those questions are still really active areas of research.
Yeah, I had to nail most of it. I mean, the salt marshes themselves are so important. Variety of different things, buffering capacity for storms, carbon sinks. And a big question is sedimentation rate for the existing marshes. Is it going to be able to keep up with sea level rise? And based on some studies that have been done in Maine, you know, a number of around 4 millimeters per year has been thrown out before. And sea levels rising at about 3.2 millimeters per year right now. So the big question, of course, is how is the marsh going to respond? Right now, about most of the marsh systems in Maine are made up of what we call high marsh, which is that matted salt marsh or grass. So it looks like matted hair on the marsh. That's 70% existing marsh, and about 30% is low marsh, the tall cord grass that grows adjacent to the channels. Some of the simulations that we've looked at show that as sea level rises, what's going to happen is the low marsh is going to move into the high marsh because we have a lot of high marsh and it has room to move. The high marsh is going to move a little bit into transitional areas where there are freshwater wetlands, et cetera. But in areas that are developed or areas where you've got steep slope uplands, it's probably going to get pinched out. Now, erosion of those adjacent steep slope uplands might lead to more sedimentation, which allows marsh to keep up. But, and then you're also going to have conversion of the low part of the marsh to mudflat, something that's already happening, because if it gets wet too many times, it's going to start drowning, basically. The marsh drowns. And so, yeah, this is a good example from Wells. There's no accommodation space for the marsh to move here. You're going to have transition of species and then just loss of marsh. And unfortunately, on this side where Route 1 is, it's a very steep slope, and there isn't much room for that to migrate. So accommodation space is key. But yeah, it's still in flux in terms of marsh migration in response to sea level rise. So evolving topic basically on a day-to-day basis. Yeah, so that's just a general picture of what might happen because that's already what is happening. But it's still not known if that 4 millimeter number is really that threshold, or if they can even go a little bit higher.
Yeah, I love that. I love that you highlighted rate there, because when we're talking about human infrastructure, we often talk about a value sea level rise will go to, but these natural systems are more resilient, and for them, it's more about rates of sea level rise.
Is there any importing of sand and sediment that's happening? I see in California, they do it for kind of different reasons, but is where they lost all their sand and then they have to bring in a bunch, or is there any of that?
Yeah, in Maine, we beneficially reuse dredged sand from federal navigation channels, and that's placed up on the beach for beach nourishment. Or in wells, it's actually been placed offshore in something we call near shore placement. So you put it in strategic locations, and then that sand gets pushed to the beach over time, builds up the beach. So that's been done in Saco, Wells, and Scarborough, and a little bit in Kennebuck. Those are the navigation channels that are dredged on a regular basis. My understanding is York County and a number of communities have now partnered and have purchased a dredge, which is great because a lot of smaller projects that don't get dredged on a regular basis can now be dredged, and that maybe the materials clean can be beneficially used. On the marsh side, there is something called thin layer placement, where instead of taking that sand and putting it on a beach, it's sprayed up onto a marsh. And the idea is you're artificially giving it that sediment that it needs to keep up with sea level rise. But you can't smother the entire marsh in 4 feet of sand, otherwise it's going to grow. So it's a very tricky science, but that's something that is being implemented in Massachusetts and some states to the south. It has not been done in Maine yet that I know of.
We have a question from the Zoom audience, Alex, for you, and this kind of gets back to the citizen activism issue that we were talking about earlier. Can you talk, Alex, about how you think the visual arts can be influence public opinion on this issue of sea level rise and climate change? And do you have any suggestions for artists and photographers about how to do that?
Oh, definitely. I think very effective in being able to see issues clearly. So in the aerial perspective, it's just another view of looking at this at a larger scale. And it's quite interesting, as a pilot and flying, is how different when you go from 1,000 feet to 2,000 feet to 4,000 feet, you're seeing completely different pictures in a different scale. And these are easy or somewhat easier to convey to people what's actually happening and talking about it. And for me too, going out and actually photographing this, I'm starting to see these issues that I hadn't really anticipated seeing. I mean, one of the things that I didn't realize is just, how fortified the coast was with sea walls, houses with their own walls, how that's deteriorating. You can sense a lot about how things are transitioning in time. That's another, dimension to the problem, is the time aspect. And so I think, for me, looking at things visually and framing it and putting it into a perspective, I think people likewise, as photographers and just looking into a rectangle and trying to picture things, really, the exercise of doing that gives you some clarity as to the issues. And it's quite interesting. I mean, if I went out and photographed again the coast, I'd come back with a completely different set of pictures. Part of it just from the experience of my earlier flights, things that I might want to look and realize that I hadn't really fully captured. So I think it's a very powerful way of evaluating the situations. One of the things that I really sort of appreciate more than ever is that I think it's going to be natural systems and being able to stand and mend the problems more than with hardscapes. I mean, just looking at all the seawalls between Portsmouth and Portland and seeing them falling down and how they're, probably a 15, 20-year lifespan, kind of a futile exercise. Whereas you put in a natural system, it's self-maintaining. So that would be sort of the answer to that. And I would encourage people to go out and think about these issues in a visual way. Just brand new looking at it.
One thing I would say is that's been our biggest obstacle in Camden is the need for people to visualize things. We've been able to get people to do a lot of volunteer, like drone photography and things like that, and that's great, to a certain extent for visualizing the problem. But where we really come up short is we need artists or people that are really good maybe with Photoshop to be able to take those images and say, okay, this is what it would look like if we did this. This is what it would look like if we did this. And we have engineers that are willing to draw like really complex sort of drawings, but we don't have a lot of just artists that have enough knowledge of natural systems and sort of everything that we're talking about to be able to quickly sketch things out so that people can, you know, visualize different changes over time. So, I mean, I think that's a huge part of this. We've got a lot of science, but we really need people to be able to kind of use their imagination and draw things.
Alex, was there a photograph or maybe a place that we didn't include in this that was striking to you when you were flying up and down the coast?
Oh, yeah, there were a lot of things that, you know, interesting things, you know, to look at. And there's a lot of in between. And there were, you know, good examples of coastal erosion that you did see where it wasn't fortified, and you could see why people are actually fortifying as, you know, the porches are starting to fall off the front of the house, things like that. Yeah, you get a sense as to, you know, how extensive the problem is.
Yeah, I think we need to be mindful of the time, you know, maybe people are willing to stick around and have a conversation, but I just want to thank everybody for coming, and I want to thank the panelists especially for giving their amazing insight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. There were a lot of really great questions that I don't think we quite got to. So I believe we have pretty much everybody's email address from registration, so we can send a follow-up email with some of these resources and invite you to continue the conversation. So thanks again, and thanks for joining us, and have a lovely evening.